Hey, folks, good evening, and thanks for joining me on Phantoms and Monsters Radio. And I welcome all new listeners and members to the chat, as well as first timers in the chat. Um, Mimicking human and animal voices is a phenomenon reported by witnesses and experiencers. This anomalous activity has become more prevalent in recent years. What creatures and/or entities are responsible for these incidents? In the Guillermo del Toro-directed film Mimic, an entomologist genetically creates a mirrored insect to kill cockroaches that carry a deadly virus. And the modified insects then attempt to destroy their only remaining predator, which is human. So, in the real world, are there evolved or fabricated creatures seeking to confuse humans into making dangerous and fateful decisions or choices? Well, listen to these reports and decide for yourself. So let's get started.
We live in a reality of phantoms and monsters. They exist among us, and sometimes they win. Even the devil was an angel once. The world has its own rules, and these rules are not human. Some of us seek answers to the origin and existence of cryptids and the unexplained. Join us as we venture beyond the known and accepted boundaries. Welcome to our nightmare. I think you're going to like it.
So, before we go any further, I want to mention that this channel is made possible by clicking on the subscribe and like buttons and by you sharing our programming. Super chat and super thanks donations are appreciated. You can click the dollar icon located below the chat box. The Buy Me a Coffee link is also shown below. Thanks for your consideration. Now, your comments are always welcomed. Tell me which accounts you found interesting in the presentation or suggestions for upcoming shows. I want to again thank our chat moderators, Bernadette, Marla, Thomas, and Mike for their commitment to me and the channel. Now, if you're in the chat and you have a question, please use all caps, and I'll try to get to each one after the presentation. And we are now with streaming with Elevate Souls Production Network. So we're going to have a few bumps here and there, but we've got some new graphics and music and everything coming up. So I hope it, it goes to the level that you're expecting from the show. So thanks again for joining me. So disturbing mimics. Recently, there had been strange sightings and sounds in the southeast Ohio Appalachians, especially odd clicking sounds in the trees in early morning and human whispers at night. So the witness states to me, we live in the Appalachians in the southeastern Ohio Valley, part of the Wayne National Forest. Now, recently, I've felt and heard unexplained things, odd, eerie clicking sounds in the trees, particularly in the morning, mimicking human whispers at night. along with the heavy feeling of an evil presence. I think some who aren't usually susceptible to feeling such things could possibly ignore this. It is so thick and heavy. Whatever this is, my husband knows and has seen some things, but always in denial. His son saw something recently that scared him so bad that he came back in the house so quickly. I had never seen him move like that, repeatedly saying, "Oh Lord Jesus, help me." He would be hugging himself in the bed under the covers. He's 30 years old as well. Reacting like that is unlike him. I've never known the boy to pray at all, let alone so fervently. Our dogs don't like being around whatever this is either. Their hair also stand on end. Our youngest dog wanted to bury himself under the covers of our bed. I listen to our dog because they know, sense, hear, and even see things we cannot. Also, the crows usually feed during the morning have been behaving unusually as well, calling like there's something wrong happening. They're coming around less and less too. That's concerning. So one night last month, we woke up to find that a huge tree limb from our older tree crashed down at some point and had taken out parts of the neighboring black walnut tree and impaled the ground coming down. There wasn't a storm that night at all. So, what caused this huge branch to fall like this? And the tree it came from is so huge and it got to be ancient. I came across a post looking for uh, what animals make odd alien-like sounds, and some clicking during the early morning up in the trees of the Appalachian Ohio Valley. I hadn't found anything yet, and there hasn't been any show to allege billions of cicada broods mentioned to come. So that's not it. My birds we know of making sounds during the day. I don't have an explanation for the other crap we're experiencing. So I can't find the source of the sound either. I do know there are more to this world than meets the eye, and nothing is as it seems. Most of the time, it doesn't. We may all find out sooner than we think, whether we want to or not. We do not. Excuse me. We do we even want to know? Maybe not at all. Who knows? All I can say is pray like you've never prayed before. My stepson did, and he hasn't acted the same since. Now, in this next account, a teen boy was at his family's cabin in northwestern Maine. Along with the family dog, he sensed something unusual in his vicinity and heard it mimic his voice and words. Now, he tells me, I had an scary experience happening to me in 2018 that has stuck with me throughout the years, and I'm wondering if you could possibly help me explain what I witnessed in the woods all those years ago. I was about 16 at the time, and I'm half indigenous. I was visiting my uncle on my mom's side, the indigenous side, at his cabin located in the woods of northwestern Maine because I was driving my grandpa up to visit them for the fall season. Now, the cabin was rather small and could only accommodate my uncle, auntie, grandpa, so I was told to sleep in the camper that was set back further into the woods. Now, that evening went by as usual. My auntie made dinner and we all laughed and shared stories and eventually turned in for the night. I took a flashlight and started my way out to the camper. About halfway down, I shut off the flashlight and looked up to admire the night sky. It was at this point I noticed how quiet the forest had become. There were no birds or sounds of crickets or rustling leaves, just pure silence. I suddenly got this intense feeling of dread deep within my gut, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice in my head told me to bolt to the camper as fast as I could. For some reason, my instincts told me I didn't belong there and something was watching me. When I made it to the camper, I slammed the door shut and double locked it, closing the window blinds. I swear I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I laughed at myself for getting so worked up over nothing. The entire night was restless in my sleep. I couldn't help but hear footsteps and movement all around the camper. I told myself it was just a curious animal or a grazing deer, but my dreams were haunted by something I couldn't see. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the final experience of that weekend. By morning, all seemed normal. I thought about mentioning what had happened to my grandfather over breakfast, but worried that he'd just brush it off as being dramatic or too used to the city life. I let the odd night slide off my mind as I enjoyed the day with my family and their German Shepherd, Jack. Just to calm my nerves, I asked Jack to accompany me on the camper that evening to, ensure I felt safe. The walk back was once again fine until I began to enter the tree line. I'm not sure if it was because I was feeling nervous as well, but Jack seemed to be on edge and his ears perked up and his head was on a swivel. That night, we slept in the bed of the trailer. He slept in the bed of the trailer with me. I felt safer with the dog there. However, I had an extremely awful dream in which when I woke, Jack was staring at the wall of the trailer with his hackles standing on end. Now, when the morning came, I packed my bags to leave in the afternoon, brought Jack out of the trailer, and led him out into the small field between the cabin and the thick woods. I kicked the ball so that Jack could fetch it. He raced down to grab the ball, and until his full sprint turned into a full stop, digging his paws into the dirt meters past where the ball had landed. He was standing stiff, fur on end, ears pinned back and unmoving. I called for him to come, which we always responded to, but he didn't even acknowledge me. I began to walk down to where he was, calling his name a little bit louder, still with no response. I grabbed him by the collar, getting kind of worried at this point as his eyes stared directly into the trees. I yelled his name loudly, giving him a little tug. The forest was silent. Moments later, the silence was broken by an echo of my voice yelling back. However, this echo was delayed and distorted. It sounded like me, but also not like me. I froze and investigated the dark woods, holding my breath only for another scream to come from the woods in my voice. I immediately turned and booked it back to the cabin. I came to my auntie trying to tell her that there was something out there in those woods. She comforted me and told me it must have been nothing, but she seemed as if that wasn't the answer she wanted to give. My family is rather superstitious, especially me, and I'm guessing she didn't want me to overthink anything. I left that afternoon and have not been back since that weekend. A friend of mine told me to share my story with you as you might have an idea of what I experienced. I'm not sure if I encountered a cryptid, bad spirit, or just an overactive imagination. Now, in this next account, a group of Job Corps residents in Mammoth Cave National Park hears a baby crying sound late at night. Then the sounds of a woman screaming. Was it a cryptid mimicking human sounds? So in the account, they state, "Hi, Lon. I went to Job Corps in Kentucky, smack in the middle of Mammoth Cave National Park. It's a very beautiful area. We weren't supposed to leave the campus, but no one was following that rule. We'd organize hikes and stuff like the park rangers told us not to do. So one day we get a bit turned around and it's close to 10 p.m. by the time we realized where we were and decided to head back. Expecting to get chewed out since lights out would be in effect and the doors would be locked, so we're screwed already in the regard to getting back on time. We decided just to take it leisurely as we go. We're about 100 or so feet from the edge of the woods when we hear a baby crying. Some of us wanted to go check it out, but the guy who was leading us around told us to shut up and listen. Said it sounded funny. It kept repeating the exact same cry each time. It was like a sound bite being looped. Then it got closer, and we all heard what sounded like a woman screaming for her life. We all got the hell out of the situation as fast as we could. What do you believe it was? Now, It could have very well been a bobcat. I've heard bobcats scream, and it sounds a lot of times just like what they described. But, I've also heard and read accounts of possible cryptid activities related to this type of phenomena. Bigfoot had been known to mimic human sounds, so maybe it was that, but who knows? In this next account, a group of family members had rented a cabin near South Haven, Michigan. The father and son both start to hear strange noises, including mimicking phenomena. He tells me, my dad, grandma, grandpa, and I were attending my cousin's wedding in a small rural town just outside of South Haven, Michigan in the late summer of 2022. We rented a small house in town, which was in a very wooded area just off the small lake. Something felt extremely off as soon as I got out of the car onto the rental property. That's the best way I can describe it. That something seemed off and I was immediately uneasy. Now, but being a skeptic as I am, I shrugged it off and chalked it up just being tired and anxious. The night we arrived, my dad and I were having smoke outside and noticed how weird everything sounded. It was about 11 p.m. and there was no one else around. The trees were crackling incredibly loud and we were hearing strange animal noises, but nothing too out of the ordinary. Just the type of animal noises you'd hear in rural Michigan. But they just sounded particularly strange for us for some reason. We said goodnights and went to bed. The next morning, my dad told me that he had gone outside for a smoke about 2 a.m. that morning and heard what sounded to him like someone close by banging on the metal siding. He said it sounded like it was just next door, but didn't hear anything leading up to or preceding the loud banging, like footsteps or anything like that. We shrugged it off and laughed. The second night was when I heard the thing that I still can't stop thinking about a year later. It's about 11 p.m. or midnight around that time, and I was having my last smoke of the night. My grandparents were already asleep. My dad had just gotten into bed, but still awake watching TV. I was sitting on the stairs outside with my back to the house, looking straight out into the backyard. I heard someone shout my name in a very abrupt manner, loud and fast. It sounded like they were shouting toward me from the front of the house, like they were standing on the front porch shouting at me, knowing I was at the back of the house. It sounded just like my dad, but it couldn't be him because I didn't hear the front door open or close or anything like that. Being a skeptic, I reminded myself to stay calm and I quickly stepped back into the house. My dad was sound asleep. There was no way by that time I got to him, he could have even gotten back into bed. I woke him up and asked him if he had been outside screaming my name. He looked confused and said, of course not. I started to get really freaked out at that point. I tried to go to bed, but I couldn't get the scream out of my head. I was up all night trying to figure out what had happened. I was honestly contemplating leaving, getting a hotel room somewhere close by, and returning in the morning. Miraculously, I must have fallen asleep sometime around 3 a.m. We woke up the next morning, and I was so ready to get out of that town. As soon as we left, the uneasy feeling I had the entire weekend just disappeared. When I returned to work the next day, I told my coworker about the weird experience I had. Her face immediately dropped. She proceeded to inform me that it's quite common in the Appalachian area regarding cryptids and other types of creatures. Apparently, they try to get your attention by mimicking someone close to you, and when you look at them, they kidnap you or something along those lines. But I was in Michigan. I tried to look up information about the town I was in, but I just couldn't find anything remotely interesting. Has anyone else had a similar experience? Now, once again, I mean, just like with the previous post, I made on the blog, the mimicking phenomena is as described. You know, it could be a lot of different things, but this mimicking phenomena just continuously is reported to me. So in this next account, two friends were on a road trip and stopped at Mount Hood, Oregon to camp. During the night, the witness hears mimicking her and her friend's voice from the previous conversation. She tells me, I was about 26 years old when this event happened about 9 years ago. A friend and I decided to go on a 2-week road trip from Kansas, Colorado, Utah, and all down the West Coast. We camped the whole way and had an incredible time, other than occasionally having trouble finding campsites. So one day, after a fun, gluttonous night in Portland, we decided to camp on Mount Hood. It was in the middle of summer, so we expected to see other campers on the mountain, even though it was a weekday. We had to drive far up in search of a campsite because all the ones towards the bottom were closed due to fallen trees or trees that would have been falling if a strong breeze came through. I don't know what that was about, but it was a beautiful mountain and with natural spring water and clear rivers. We were excited to be there. We saw a couple of old men fishing on the way up and one family camping. They appeared to be Native American and were about five of them. We drove up quite a way before finding a nice private camp spot and setting up camp for the night. We walked around gathering wood, talking about the night in Portland and setting up the tent. The time is coming for us to go to bed, and my friend falls asleep. I'm still lying there trying to fall asleep when I hear footsteps and leaves crunching. This puts me on high alert since there weren't any people camping or close by us. I lay there with my heart racing and listening. I begin to hear voices and try to nudge my friend awake, but she's out and not really waking. I continue to listen and I start to make out the voices and words. It's our voices, having the exact conversation we had having around the campfire not even an hour before. It didn't last long before silence returned. Needless to say, I've had a very hard time sleeping that night. So, the next account, a family with a disabled son rents a cabin along a remote lake in St. Louis County, Minnesota. A possible Bigfoot begins mimicking the sound made by the son. Now, they tell me. We had traveled up near the Canadian border in St. Louis County, Minnesota, a few summers ago. We rented a cabin off the grid in the middle of nowhere. Our son is severely disabled, and while he's nonverbal, he isn't quiet. He makes very loud sounds, guttural shrieks, and whoops. This spot takes about an hour off road to get to. It's near logging roads, but there are no people, very rugged roads. The cabin is on a 320 acres of lake and surrounded by well over 40 acres of forest. It's just us there. Plenty more acres, but that's just the acreage around the cabin. That night, my son was standing on the deck. It's on the second floor of the cabin. He was jumping and bashing and howling. The pounding of his jumping on the deck was reverberating throughout the forest. This was something we wouldn't usually worry about, but not here. It felt great not to have to worry. This is the very reason why we were here, so no one could judge us or get upset by his sounds. Now, off to the west, we begin hearing something. It sounded as if it was mimicking my son. Just didn't feel real at first. It was a no way this is happening moment. It mimicked him unbelievably well. It was loud and sounded as though it had the lung capacity of 20 men. It was an animal. It didn't sound angry at all or menacing. It just a long, strong mimicking sound. I don't really know how to explain it. We went inside and did our best to ignore it. I felt the entire rest of the trip as if we were being watched. I couldn't shake that feeling. It was the most uncomfortable I ever felt in my life. I cannot explain it. Just thinking about it makes me uncomfortable. Other very odd things occurred that week, but I don't really feel comfortable sharing. Almost supernatural. I know that sounds silly. Smoke alarms going off at night, etc. Just weird things. We ended up going back the next summer, so we didn't let on to our other son, who was asleep at the time, that nothing had occurred or that anything had occurred. We have had no incidents like that again. No feeling of being watched and nothing uncomfortable. But the incident that week will always stay with me. Now, in this account, two friends were fishing in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota park when they encountered a large white humanoid crawler that mimicked one of the friends' voices. He tells me, I'll never forget that night of August 14th, 2021. I was fishing in the river with my friend in the suburb of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. We loved coming to this public park to fish because it was quiet and there was a nice sandbar to fish for. Um, or to fish from. This park had a Sioux burial mound about half mile from our spot. Now, after fishing for a better part of the day, we decided to leave at dusk. We get back to our vehicles. We had to take the trail through the woods, which was about a 5-minute walk. I put a clip-on light on the bill of my hat so we could see the trail. I remember when I first glanced to head down the trail, I saw two circular white lights that I assumed were fireflies. Now, once we got further down the trail, we were closer to the area where I had seen the fireflies. It was then that I saw a pair of eyes that was either highly reflective from the light or glowing white. It wasn't long before I could make out a body. It was a very large white body on four legs, bigger than a wolf, but unnaturally skinny. I couldn't make out any facial features because its eyes were so bright. I wanted to warn my friend, but all I could manage to say was, there's something there. We had no choice but to proceed because this was the only way back to our vehicles. This thing just stared at us down from, but didn't make a sound. My friend yelled at it to try to scare it away, but it didn't react at all. I yelled at it after she did it, and it responded back, mimicking my voice. I honestly questioned myself and thought I was imagining things. So I yelled at it again, and it responded back in the same volume, same pitch, exactly like my voice. At this point, we realized this was not an animal. We both continued the path in silence, but I maintained eye contact with this creature. I felt like this thing was ready to attack us at any moment, but it just stood there staring. Eventually, we were out of the woods and I could no longer see its eyes. We made it back to our vehicles and felt a sense of relief. I asked my friend, "Did you hear that talk back? Hear that talk back to me?" She said she did, and it sounded like my voice when it responded back to us. If she hadn't heard the voice, I would have assumed I imagined it. We went over what had happened, and our stories were exactly the same, except that the creature had a wolf like head. Now, after our experience, my friend went to see a shaman. The shaman believed it was an evil spirit and performed a cleansing on her. She was still shaken up by the experience for several weeks. I tried to hire a spiritual advisor online, but when I described the experience and asked for the spiritual cleansing of my own, it said they were not available at the time. At the advice of one of my friends, I burned some tobacco and said a prayer that the entity would leave me alone. It took me several months to feel normal again, but just I still think about this every week. I tried to do further research and contacted the management of the park. They said the park we went to had ancient native remains scattered along the river and were unmarked. They said that there were more native remains in that park than any other park they had managed. Now, I contacted several Native American friends and was told the entity we encountered was a skinwalker. Now, I know skinwalkers are part of the Navajo culture, but from what I read, it checks more of the boxes than any other supernatural being or cryptid. Now, honestly, I don't think it was a skinwalker. It was probably a crawler humanoid, or even a spirit. I don't know, but I don't think it was a skinwalker. Now, this was sent to me. This incident occurred sometime in the fall of 2006. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had dense woods located directly behind it. As a child, I had a passion for exploring. I especially love exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Now, prior to the incident, I had wandered through those woods many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree that I frequently uh, enjoyed climbing, usually about the halfway mark, so I could perch myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to the peaceful sounds of nature. Now, climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploration, I carefully scaled my favorite tree and I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Naturally, being late in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes. I always felt a little sadness to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like their own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home so not to be stranded out there after dark. So after watching the sunset until I could no longer see it, I began my descent down the tree. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name. I thought nothing of it at first, as this routine had occurred plenty of times before. Then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper into the woods, rather than toward the entrance where she would always stand and call me home. My mom had never entered those woods before, at least not with me. I was eager to find her and show her all my favorite spots before it grew too dark. That's when I realized something was off. How could she have gone into the woods ahead of me? Certainly, I could have missed her, but as I said, she never entered those woods. She continued calling my name, but there was something strange about it. She sounded frantic, almost angry. Fearing that I was in trouble for the reasons currently unknown, I froze in place. As her voice drew closer, I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine exactly how angry or upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly, I heard a voice calling my name from the direction of the house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods, yet again, it wasn't an echo. Was I imagining things? I was literally hearing her beckon me from the edge of our backyard, as well as ahead of me. My legs suddenly turned to jelly. I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. Come here, right now. The voice that was originally believed to be hers screamed from just ahead. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawing closer. I didn't ask which voice was my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that just unnerved me. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could carry me. It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste. Even though my house wasn't very far from where I had been standing, those woods had seemed larger to me than they ever did at previous. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now sounding desperate. Panic set in as my actual mother finally came into view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods in the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped foot into the backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safe in the house and our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods. Appearing confused by the question, she told me that of course she hadn't. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she had heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was also no. Although I was still very much shaken up, I managed to explain everything that had happened as clearly and as rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have imagined it, that I was spending too much time out there by myself. Now, the incident of those woods have stayed with me to this day. I can still hear that voice as clearly as a bell. Whoever or whatever was calling my name sounded exactly like my mother, but I know it wasn't her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange in a way that I still couldn't fully explain. I didn't go back in those woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out around very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seem entirely plausible. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could have pulled it off. Not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt that it was anyone else because, as I stated before, we lived in a rural area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have found my name and where to find me? We've since moved out of that house, but my mother and I occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard anything or unusual out there, and I know it probably I know it probably shouldn't, but what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that day and never had anything out of the ordinary occur. The best explanation I can give at this point is maybe it was a doppelganger or possibly a demon, but I'm unsure. So, folks, you have questions, go ahead and put them in all caps and put them up there for me. We'll try to answer them for you. Palaquin X Vibes asked, has a Bigfoot ever been reported to sounding like a baby crying? Yeah, I have had a couple of those. Um, I um, I talked to a gentleman here in Pennsylvania years ago in an investigation I did. What county was that? I think it was up in Perry County. It was in Perry County, and he said he heard a lot of baby crying sounds in the woods for years. But when I went up there to investigate later on, I mean, I didn't see anything. I didn't find any evidence of it. But he did contact me later and said that he did see a Bigfoot, and he thinks that was what caused it. I've heard others as well. So I think, and Gordian Slayer asked, "Are mimics real?" And I think they are. I think it is a real phenomenon. Uh, could it be a cryptid of some type? Could it be pale crawlers? We've heard pale crawlers, stories of pale crawlers that have made these weird mimicking sounds. Uh, I've had witnesses tell me the same thing. Also, in the spiritual world or different energies, they can also mimic as well. So I guess it's one of those things that this phenomena is real, and people do continue to report it. Gordian Slayer as not just the Dark Souls thing. I don't think so. I think it's part of it's just not nothing evil or something malevolent doing this. Um, but yeah, have been a lot of reports over the years. Did you know the Ghost Rider is real? No, I didn't. Jose Sanchez, what would you say is one of the main reasons that these creatures use mimicking? To deceive, maybe, or something else? Uh, from what I have read and seen, um, I think they like. I think they'd like to see the response of people when they do it. I mean, it might seem cruel, but maybe they are trying to. Maybe they are trying to get someone to go into a situation that's dangerous or such. I don't really know. Um, Most of the witnesses who have encountered this mimicking sound don't let it fool them into going or doing something that they don't want to do. Question: Wally Tango Foxtrot. Any commonality with moon phase for cryptid sightings? I have been asked that many times. I don't know. I haven't really associated any cryptid sightings with moon phases. There's something we also looked into with this Chicago Mothman phenomena, as far as the moon cycles and such. And we just really haven't determine that that has any connection to the sightings itself. Are mimics like spook lights? Asked Palquin X Vibe. Maybe in the respect that it shows itself for whatever reason, but usually the spook lights are at a distance as opposed to something mimicking nearby. It could be related though. Kevin Emery, could it be telepathic link that gives them the ability to mimic better? Could be. Yeah, it could be. Of course, many of us have heard about cryptids mimic being able to psychically connect with witnesses. There may be something to that. It may be something that they're able to mimic a voice even without even hearing it psychically. Yeah, absolutely. Sir Wolf, Alon, have you heard of anyone investigating a mimic type sound and go missing? Um, Not offhand, but if they went missing, you probably wouldn't be able to tell you the story, or unless they came back and told you. Um, I don't know. I can imagine that with so many missing 411 cases, maybe some mimicking was involved with it. It's possible. Okay, folks. Well, I want to thank you for coming in tonight and for you watching and chatting. If you donated, it's truly appreciated, and your support is what makes all this possible. So please like, subscribe, and share. Now, if you have a sighting report or encounter report that you'd like to be considered for the personal report show and or posted on Phantoms and Monsters, feel free to contact my email, Lon Strickler at phantomsandmonsters.com. So until we meet again, have a safe and healthy weekend, and we'll see you next Friday night. Take care.